welcome to our webinar today. I am so excited about this particular topic where we're going to be chatting about company parties, where anything that can go wrong often seems to go wrong. And the question is for us, how can we try and mitigate a party going from phenomenal to a complete disaster? I am even more excited about this particular webinar because I get to talk with the amazing Chantal Egan, who, if you don't already know, is an attorney with over 15 years of experience, which is pretty darn impressive. That's more than my entire HR career. So Chantal, I am super impressed by you, and I'm so excited to learn from you. Chantal is Medina McKelvey's partner and head of advice and counsel. Chantal, I would love to learn a little bit more about you before we get into the questions, as I'm sure would our audience. Tell me a little bit more about your career journey and how you got into this area of counsel. Is that what you call it in the legal world?
Yes, advice and counsel. That is what I do. Well, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for including me. Part of my journey that got me to this webinar today was, I started out as an attorney 15 years ago, but before that, I was an educator for 4 years. So my interest in people and how people interact has been something that's just been kind of rooted in my, entire professional career. I started off my legal career at Jones Day and then transitioned to Seyfarth Shaw and was a partner there. And while I was there, I headed their national investigations and crisis management practice, which, let's be honest, holiday parties that go awry often feel like a crisis. And until I transitioned to Medina McKelvey, which is a boutique firm here in California. I'm based here in San Francisco.
Love it. Also, love that you're based in San Francisco, which, can I just say, San Francisco's weather always throws me off. I always feel like it's going to be colder or hotter, and it's just like 50 degrees year round. Am I making this up?
You're not. And really what I tell people is like dress for fall year round. So it could be hot, it could be cold. You have to wear layers. It's going to change throughout the day and which side of the street you're on. But if you dress for late October, early November, you're usually in good shape.
Love it. Chantal, I'm super excited about this chat today. In particular, speaking about your education background, I think it just brings a unique spin to some of these discussions. I think sometimes when you're talking about legal and compliance things, it can get into an area that's almost so dry that it's hard to identify with, right? Or understand in ways that, the people team can actually action and apply on. And so I'm really excited. I mean, if anyone in the audience can't tell already, the vibe is very different from what you usually get at one of these conversations. Chantal, I'm really excited for me and for the whole audience to learn from you today. So with that said, let's kick it off with our first question, which I think it's important to call out the elephant in the room. Company holiday parties are supposed to be about celebrating your employees' hard work and boosting morale. They're supposed to be a fun thing. And yet, oftentimes they go awry. I am thinking of, some of those horrible examples from The Office, which still traumatize me. There's some episodes from The Office that I, as an HR person, just cannot watch. They can be too much anxiety.
I thought I was the only one. I too sometimes have to pause it because I will get a little heart palpitation.
You feel that the first 2 episodes of season 1 are a no-go for me. They are a no-go for me. Hilarious. So my question is, why are we talking about risk mitigation in the context of a company party?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head by what the goal of the party is. The goal of the party is to celebrate, to make people feel like they are included, they're part of a community, they're part of the future of this community. And when we overlay some of the things that happen at parties, whether that's, drinking, after hours activities, sometimes there's some blurred lines regarding kind of roles and responsibilities. Then if we don't think about risk and we don't think about it on the front end, then we could end up with a situation where the goal of our party is completely undermined because we have people that feel isolated excluded, and that they don't trust perhaps whether it's their leaders or their peers in a way that they did before. And we want to make sure that we're taking steps to mitigate that. So I think of it instead of as a, these are the big bad rules and these are all the the anti-fun police. I think it's really like, let's make sure everybody has a really good time. And if we do that and we think about this kind of risk mitigation as part of that, then we can get a lot closer to ensuring that people do have a good time and they leave feeling like they're, a part of the community. It would be the same if, you were hosting a dinner party and, somebody is vegan and serve roast beef and don't give them any other options. Like, that's not being a good host. You want to think about who's attending, how this, how you're setting the table, if you will. And we want to do the same thing with a holiday party.
I love that framing so much because I can tell you from the HR perspective, I think that there is some underlying fear around even addressing the topic of risk mitigation because it can come across as the fun police. It can come across as Melanie, you're just not getting the point of this party. We're just supposed to have fun. We're just trying to have pizza and some ping pong. Why are you turning this into a whole HR thing? And I think your framing is honestly textbook what people should be communicating to their CEOs, to their leadership team in the face of inevitable, understandable pushback when we come to them and say, hey, I want to have a happy, fun party too. And also, in service of that, let's make sure that we're having some of these conversations up front.
Absolutely. Let me tell you, it really helps too from the back end because nobody wants to be talking about the holiday party in late December, January, February, but that's sometimes what can happen if, you don't take these steps, these preventative steps to begin with.
Oh, and I can just imagine how many of us in the audience, I mean, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, I could think of very specific examples when I was still talking about the holiday party, end of December, January, February.
Yes.
For
We were ready to close that chapter, ready to close the door, but there were still things that we had to handle because we didn't have proper planning to begin with.
I would love to dig into that a little bit. You spoke about the fact that, hey, if we don't handle these things up front, right,
Mhm.
there are some things that can happen that can really undermine the actual goals and intent of this party. And listen, I'm in HR. I'm not going to ask you for hyper specifics, all right? But I'm curious, especially for anyone on the call who's maybe newer to the HR world, who maybe is newer to the people ops side of the HR world. What are some of what are some scenarios that you've seen, some shocking scenarios that you've encountered, especially in the capacity of your role at a holiday party, at a company party, that have made you understand the importance of, hey, let's handle some of these things up front to avoid them down the line?
I mean, I probably could just tell you stories about the holiday parties I attended. I will say, as an employment litigator and a counselor, I always in December when I get that call on a Saturday or Sunday morning, I'm always like, oh, something happened at the holiday party last night, and I just have seen a wide range of things, both in terms of counseling, how do we work through this, the planning aspect, and then also as an investigator. And I would say the things that, there's some things where it's, so outrageous. I mean, without divulging, of course, any privileged information, fights in the parking lot, someone punching somebody else, people drinking too much, falling on tables and chairs and breaking all furniture, very, rock and roll-esque, if you will. But I think the things that end up being like the most surprising are tend to happen actually outside the holiday party itself. They tend to happen, people want to keep the party going. They go over to a bar, they go to somebody's house. And that's really where kind of education about what people's roles and responsibilities are if they see something that makes them uncomfortable really kick in. So when we talk about even planning, we have to think about this not just planning for the party, but how are we creating a culture in our workplace where people feel comfortable and empowered to come forward if they see something or experience something that they just don't feel is quite right. Because that's going to help you create, foster a culture that is, having a culture that doesn't have harassment, discrimination, things like that we all worry about. And more importantly, get back to that root of the party where everybody feels celebrated and they had a great time.
What a powerful point you just made around the reality that the risk is not uh restricted to the physical space where you initiate the party. It literally can happen after the party when you think you're done. And I think this is really important because I've actually I made a post about this on LinkedIn where I was like, hey, I'll tell me your stories. And wow, did we get some wild responses, which is great. Thank you all. I really appreciate it. Always educational for me. And we had some people who, and I want to have empathy because, to be honest, until you had spoken, I really hadn't thought about it in this way, who had shared that I actually, as an HR person, remove myself from the situation before the after party starts because I don't want to see it. I don't want it to become a thing. And what
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing from you is, but things might still happen regardless of whether or not you are there. And
Yeah.
I'm really, really excited to dive into this just a little bit deeper. I'll pause because it looked like you had something to add there.
Well, and it's so funny because the what you just said is so classic. I hear it a million times over. HR is like, I'm out. Like
Yeah.
I don't want to see it. But you have to think about it. Like it goes the whole gamut. If you have, an executive or a manager that comes in, they have the company credit card, or they then submit for reimbursement. All of a sudden there's these kind of blurred lines about like whether or not this is really a company event. But I think the bigger picture issue is you want to foster a culture where when people feel like they're doing something that's work related and they feel uncomfortable or that something isn't quite jiving with either your policies or the expectation of behavior, that you have a culture where they feel like they can come and talk to their people team about what happened. Um, and like I said, like that starts long before the party.
I want to talk about the specific tactical stuff. But before we jump into that, I really want to help paint the picture for anyone tuning into this right now. You mentioned that, sometimes you'll get a call on Saturday morning and you know what that means. My question to you is, could you give us a little more insight into the experience on the HR side when something like this happens? What is going through an HR professional's mind when, unfortunately, things go awry at a party? Maybe furniture got broken, but maybe it's more serious. Maybe there was an actual harassment situation that we're going to need to look into. What does that look like for the HR professional experiencing this in the moment?
You mean after they like put their head in their hands and are just like, you mean after that? Um,
Oh, I love that. And like let's acknowledge that, right? Sometimes there is that feeling. It's like, are you kidding me? Are
if
you
I'm the only
kidding
grown
me?
up in the room. No, I mean, once they get over that, I would say that, from my point of view, from, helping them counsel through the issues or being engaged as an investigator, I mean, really, they really kind of put their very traditional HR hat on. It's as if it's, any workplace issue that comes into play. What makes it more complicated is the fact that it's like outside the typical construct of of the workday. And so, for example, what can make it really challenging is you could have somebody who, is not a manager of someone else. And so normally you wouldn't have to deal with any kind of interpersonal dynamics between the two of them. But then something happened at the work party that all of a sudden these two cross paths. And, it's very tempting in those situations, but well, they never have to work together again. Like let's just kind of sweep it under the rug. And I'm certainly not saying that's what HR professionals do, but I think sometimes that's kind of the obstacle that they face when explaining to the business why it's still worthwhile to look into those issues, even though on a going forward basis, perhaps they don't, interact. Or perhaps this is somebody that you invited in. It's a guest that was engaging in some questionable behavior. And it's like, well, does it really matter for us as a going forward business? And the answer to that from a liability perspective is absolutely yes. I mean, you're creating I mean, I know I'm kind of like, beating the same drum here, but it's all about that workplace culture. And every single person you bring in, you are responsible for making sure that your anti-harassment, your anti-discrimination policy, and so on and so forth, that you're protecting your employees from third parties, from a manager that perhaps they don't necessarily deal with all the time. But we don't want to start making exceptions. So I'd say from the HR perspective, with that type of situation, part of them sometimes is really just kind of talking to the business about why it's important to still follow their same typical process when it was the holiday party, and perhaps it's like an atypical fact pattern instead of just, chalking it up to, oh, it's kind of, one and done. And I would say the other thing too, that with HR professionals, I think the fine line that they have to cross is like, or they have to be careful not to cross, is like, is how much of this is just kind of personal and how much of this is work related? And my advice on that front is that sometimes you don't know until you kind of get into it. And in my experience, what is kind of the typical situation is when there is an investigation and something has been substantiated, there tends actually to be a bit of a pattern and maybe something that was flying under the radar that HR didn't realize. But the holiday party, when you get this microcosm of people together, kind of showed where some cracks were, that previously were just kind of hidden in a bubble, but now got, brought to the light. And so I think with the HR professionals, it's that balance of trying to figure out like, okay, am I pushing too far? Am I going too far into the weeds? So I would say the next section, kind of like really important next step for them, is really just to understand from the point of view of the person that's coming forward, or really if the HR person witnessed it, like, what is it that happened and what is it that we're trying to figure out whether or not that's a violation of our policies and we need to do something about it.
I really love the holistic approach that you're taking here. It's so critical, right? This is one piece of an entire ecosystem of things that could be happening, right? Emphasizing this idea that there could be underlying issues that have been going on, and the holiday party really just brought it to light, right? You also talk about liability, right? Because this could be a part of a larger pattern of behavior. I'm curious to know from your perspective, especially because I imagine that there are people on this call who are struggling to get buy-in from their leadership team in terms of just how important some of these things are, especially if something does happen. Can you walk us through a little bit walk us through what the impact is when something like this happens and what the impact is if it doesn't get properly addressed?
Well, the impact can be quite big. And think about it just in a workplace environment. And, somebody, we'll make up a fact pattern. Someone's in, at the printer, and a manager comes by and inappropriately touches that person. I mean, it's a no-brainer. You're going to look into that. You're going to investigate. You're going to take action. If the exact same thing happens at the holiday party, there shouldn't be a difference in how it is that you respond and react. Because if this ever is brought to a lawsuit, they're going to look at each and every one of those events. There's not a, get out of jail free card because we were at a party. That doesn't actually apply. There could be rationale about what your remediation measures are, but the risk doesn't change. So for example, let's say somebody has too much to drink. They overindulge. They do some things that are, not using their best judgment. Is that a nice way to say it? And they could, the company could find, okay, this person did engage in this behavior that doesn't line up with our values, our culture, our policy. But this person has been working with us for 10 years. When we looked into it, this was a misstep. And, we're going to tell this person that they can't drink at the next event. Or if there is another incident, then we're going to take further measures. Like, there's a balancing act between, finding that something happened and then what is appropriate in terms of remediation. And that is very fact specific. And like, one other thing I want to say from like a liability perspective is that it's important to remember that when we're looking at these offsite events, that there isn't the law is actually pretty clear that if it's company sponsored, it's like it's happening at the office. And so we can't make exceptions based on the fact that it's a party, because we're the hosts. I mean, think of it this way. I mean, once again, kind of going back to that dinner party example, you let someone in your house, you have them in for dinner, and then they trip and they fall and they break their leg. I mean, it happened at your house. It could be part of your responsibility. It's the same concept where, just because it's a party doesn't mean you get a free pass.
I think you worded that so well. And I think, what it makes me think about as well from the HR perspective is when something like this happens, it's so hard to come back from it. Like, even beyond the liability perspective, the blast radius is so huge. The trust with your employees is broken. Who wants to go to the next company event? Who's now questioning, if this has been going on reasonably, right? Reasonably so. And so, yeah, it just feels like both from a legal perspective and from just a cultural perspective, the risk is so enormous. Why wouldn't you want to put some risk mitigation in place?
Right. And one thing I want to, that you said that I think is really important, it's like maybe people won't want to participate going forward. And there's really like two things to think about. One trend that I'm noticing, especially since COVID, is I've seen a delay in people coming forward with complaints because they're starving for activity. They want to do the fun stuff. They want to have the events, and they don't want like, oh, I saw, one person made a bad mistake. I'd rather just push it under the rug and not have the company cancel, all events going forward. Like, I don't want to, be the one to tattle and then, the anti-fun police come to town. So I'd say that's actually something that's kind of interesting to think about, where it's my experience, it's been less about like, I don't want to participate in these events going forward, and more about I'm worried that one or two people that made some bad choices are going to ruin it for the rest of us. And I'm hesitant to come forward because of that. And so I think that's the other thing to kind of keep in mind. And then the other piece of the puzzle, that other side that I want to talk about, is that issue of belonging. Because once again, that's the goal of the party. So what you said is just so insightful, which is, people could just voluntarily take themselves out and be like, oh, I'm just going to kind of stick to myself. I don't want to get involved in this kind of stuff. Like, oh, this is what people do. And I will say too, what I'm noticing for those of you that are managing remote environments, a lot of time the holiday party is the first or one of the few times that people get together in person. And so it's a really valuable time to spend together to create culture. And so we want to make sure that we're setting up the party for success so that people don't walk away and say, wow, I've been working from my home office and I thought everybody was really nice and friendly, but it turns out that I'd misjudged people when I was working remotely. So it's an opportunity that we want to create sure that we're fostering that sense of community.
What a great point. I have personally felt it when we do in-person events. There's just like this whoosh of, it's relief, it's excitement, it's new, it's different, and it's almost like relearning some of those social behaviors. Um,
Right.
and I think really you blew my mind reframing my original point from the perspective of maybe someone will intentionally not say a thing that they should have because they're worried that it will lead to fewer in-person events, or maybe people cracking down in such a way where these fun events are no longer fun.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's also like part of your, the workplace dynamic. It's like a post-COVID reaction. It's also, if you have uh, a, a work community that is, of a generation that they're just out of school, they're really looking to kind of they're making social relationships, they're with their peers, with their managers, as part of just their kind of like natural place that they're in their lives. Like, we want to make sure that we are tapping into all of those needs and wants, and helping that habit. The party should help fulfill that need instead of being being the opposite. And, you know, something I meant to mention too, when we were talking about kind of liability, I want us to think about another thing when we think about planning as a, you know, little tip for everybody that's planning their party is, you know, what I've seen as when I'm doing counseling, handling the crisis or in investigations, a lot of times like post party, it's hard to try to figure out like what happened, who was talking to who was where was everybody? And on that end, I encourage everybody to do as much kind of a pre-planning and control what you can. And one of the most important things I would say is if you're inviting guests to your party, you want to know who the guests are, who's the employee that they're tied to, and whether or not people showed up. That's actually incredibly helpful. And you know, it seems like uh an unnecessary step, but it's really helpful to have all that information when you're doing an investigation down the road. It also could just be helpful information to have. Like, for example, if people are coming in and you're putting name tags on and things like that, like yes, that's helpful if there's something goes wrong because someone's like, oh no, I saw the name tag. It's you know Bob. It's you know it's so and so. That's actually really helpful to instead of being like it was a person with brown hair and didn't really recognize the person. They were in an ugly Christmas sweater, but a lot of people were. That's really helpful. But back again to what I was saying earlier, it also is fostering that sense of community. Like I want you to know everybody that's here. Maybe you haven't met everybody. This is all who all our guests are. And having that kind of transparency, you get both things. You get, yes, a little insurance on the back end that you can figure out what happened. You have, you know, better clarity about the facts, but you also are fostering a sense of community, helping people get to know each other, making it easier to talk to a manager or for the manager who has, you know, a ton of, you know, direct reports under that person to be like, oh, you know, I have, you know, 100 head count underneath me. I can't remember everybody's name. And then they see the name tag and all of a sudden we have instant connection. And, you know, it takes a couple extra minutes of planning in order to make that happen. So it seems to be a worthwhile process point.
What's fascinating about everything you just shared is that what I didn't hear was let's eliminate all alcohol. Let's make sure that we are tracking every single person in terms of like shadowing them and sort of holding their hand through everything. I'm curious to know, I'd love to get into some specifics and some more tactics here, right? Very helpful to know. Super important that you understand who's present, who the plus ones are, putting people's names. What else can companies do to help mitigate risk without eliminating fun and autonomy at what's supposed to be a morale boosting event?
Yeah. So let's talk about alcohol because that's a big part of holiday parties. So I will say that having an open, unlimited bar sometimes can lead to some bad decision making. But that also combines it. If you're going to do that, you want to make sure you have a lot of food. You know, if you're going to splurge on your open bar, you also have to splurge on your food because otherwise we could have an uneven balance that, you know, results in trouble. And then conversely, I would also say, you know, it's becoming pretty typical now to have tickets or something like that where people are limited 2, 3 drinks and they're turning in their tickets. And I would say, you know, in my experience on that, I haven't gotten any feedback where people feel like, oh, I'm being, parented, or, you know, I feel like this is exercising too much control. If anything, what I've heard upon some self-reflection is from employees is that they realized, wow, I didn't actually realize how much I had normally drank at other parties until I realized how quickly I was going through my, 3 tickets, or they realized that they're like, oh, I ended the night with 2 tickets in my pocket. I didn't actually need them. But that's a way for people, for the company to kind of control and also set some, it's obviously informal parameters, but once again, that kind of like expectation of, hey, everybody still needs to act professionally, and with decorum. We still are at a work event. Um, and then I would say on the flip side, when we talk about the after party, uh, this is when you really just need to have like a, a quick reminder with people on your management team that they need to be responsible for their behavior at the party and afterwards. So if they go to an event afterwards, if they go to a bar, like they need to make sure that they might still be wearing their manager hat. So, be careful about, putting your credit card down and getting everybody a bunch of drinks. Make sure that you act professionally throughout the evening. You don't get to not be a manager just because the official office party is over.
I really love the simplicity of your first point in particular around having a lot of food around if you're going to have a lot of drinks around. I've even
No
heard,
brainer, right?
I mean, you would think so, right? And also I get that, right? It might just happen and we're not thinking about it. There was somebody who told me that one of the challenges they had was they sort of offered the drinks before the food was available. And
Yeah.
so people were, understandably, you're socializing, there's nothing around but drinks, you're going to drink. And like, yeah, there was plenty of food, but it came too late. And
Yeah.
so I really love the simplicity around some of these tips where, it actually doesn't need to be that complicated. It's just put yourself in the situation and think really holistically around what the reality of that situation might be, what that experience might be. Even managers, right? Understanding for managers, like, oh, they might need a reminder that they're still a manager even at the after party.
Exactly. And I'd say too, the other thing is make not drinking fun. Like if you're gonna have a signature cocktail, have a signature mocktail. And really lean into, I would say there's a lot of people that are just opting out of drinking now, more so than in years past. So I would lean into that. Offer fun mocktails, offer really cool, non-alcoholic craft beers and wine alternatives. There's even non-alcoholic tequila now. So there's so many options for you to still have that like fun and festive atmosphere and for people to, walk around with a fancy cocktail glass and feel like they're participating without actually having to drink. So if you normalize the mocktail culture as part of it, I think that's also really going to help.
That's such a great point. Sometimes, what I have seen is you just try and like bury it under the rug. You try and just like avoid the situation instead of leaning
Yeah.
into it and making it fun if there's going to be an alcohol-free option, as opposed to it's water and orange juice, you know?
Exactly, right? You're like, all right, look at that person that has, the club soda and lime. Um, Once again, it's that element of fun. Like you want the party to be fun. So make all the aspects of it fun. And frankly, I would say more importantly, like by doing that, you're being inclusive. You're saying all are welcome. There's not a set rules here. There's not a traditional party culture. It is come as you are. And this is a little bit off topic, but I think really still important is you have to really think about your workforce. And there's in every type of job, there is tons of different types of people and what they bring to the table. And you want them to feel celebrated at this event. So I think the other thing too is about engagement during the party. So kind of my two tips on that front is think about the folks where it's maybe more challenging for them to socialize. We want to give them something to do that's an alternative to drinking to feel comfortable or something in the more down that path. So you could have, for example, at each of the tables, it could be a guessing game about interesting facts about people that are going to be there, or um, you know, dad jokes. There's like a million different things that you can think of where, thank goodness for Google, where you could give people activities to do to help them interact with the people around them in a way that's one, helpful, builds community, helps people get to know each other, but also gives them an alternative to perhaps opening the door to drinking to excess to make them feel comfortable. Um, and I would really think about that, like how are you going to make everybody feel comfortable? And if you do that, all these kind of risk mitigation things we're talking about kind of naturally fall into place.
I love that. So one of the things that I'm really curious to dig into here is setting employees up for success when it comes to these events. And you shared such a great example on the manager front, right? Reminding them beforehand, hey, these things might happen. You're still a manager. Make sure you keep on your manager hat when this happens. What else can we do to set employees up for success before the company party to just put everyone in the mindset once that party does take place?
Mhm. Mhm. So part of this is really just playing the long game. This is about your culture and what it is that you've developed over time about expectations about how people interact. I don't recommend that you say like, all right, everybody, be on your best behavior. Things aren't different just because it's a holiday party. That's not going to turn anybody on or get anyone excited about this holiday party. But I do recommend that you continually reset the tone about what the holiday party is about. The holiday party is not about the party. The holiday party is about celebrating each other, coming together as a community. And if you're having guests, reaching out to those that are supporting your peers and your managers at home so that they can do the job that they do with you. And kind of two practical tips on that. One, I also think that it's helpful to have you actually have like an agenda for the holiday party so that people can plan. Like, this is when it starts. This is what we're going to do. We're going to have a sit down dinner. It's going to be like this. This is when it wraps up. We're going to have, vouchers so you can get a free ride home and really kind of spell it all out instead of there's going to be this 4-hour block where we're going to have a great time. Having it be just a little bit more structured. And once again, for those of your team members that crave that structure, that's going to help them walk into the party already feeling comfortable because they know what's going on. And frankly, if we make people feel comfortable, they're more likely to make better decisions, including seeing something and saying something and maybe diffusing a situation in the moment because they've kind of had this training to begin with. The other piece that I would recommend, that actually my firm did this year for our firm retreat, which I think is such a great idea if you're inviting guests. We also made a really big deal about how we were inviting people's home team. And we wanted to celebrate them as part of the holiday party. Instead of them being like just like a plus one or an add-on, it was, how can we celebrate them? So what we did is we had each of the employees that brought a plus one had to write a personal note to their plus one that was at their table when we sat down for dinner. That helped that person feel, obviously great because it was, a bunch of praise, but it also really connected them to the event, which I think once again kind of fosters that. How would you act if you know everybody in the room? And for the most part, you'd act with a sense of decorum and with respect, because you realize that this isn't just some night that you're going to throw away. This is a night of celebration. It's not a night to, go out and go crazy. So it's really about level setting in advance, giving people advance notice about the expectation of the party. And the expectation is celebration, fun, community, coming together, getting to know each other better, and then giving people a set agenda. And then if you can, really incorporating in those guests so that it really feels like we're all in this together rather than 50% of the people there are strangers. Because I will say that's also a time I'm seeing more, questionable decision-making happening is when there is guests. And I think it's because it kind of feels like just a regular run-of-the-mill party. It's almost like going to a big wedding. Like, I don't know everybody here. So if we bring them into the fold and they're part of the celebration, that has the potential at least to minimize some poor choices.
I really love that so much of this really comes down to just using common sense and being inclusive. Uh,
Yeah.
Truly. Can I ask, as we wrap up this webinar, are there any other final tips or tricks that people should keep in mind or act on in order to minimize risk at their next company event?
Mhm. So if you have had someone who's made bad decisions at a company event, they probably need a special one-on-one discussion in advance of the event. Remind them of what happened previously, remind them of the consequence, and remind them if things like that happen again, that there will be further consequences. I know that's a little bit more doom and gloom than what we've been talking about, but when we talk about risk and liability, it's that pattern of action that we're really concerned about. So we want to give people a reminder that these are the expectations. And because you made a bad choice in the past, you now have given us, in essence, like you've opened the door to let us have this special conversation with you. And it's, once again, it's a good time to have we want you to be there. This is the value of you being there. This is, we don't want you to opt out. But this is what the expectation of the night is. And we're only reminding you because you didn't live up to those expectations previously. And I think that's worthwhile, both from a risk mitigation perspective, both forward and backward looking, because then you're addressing the pattern of practice of a particular individual, and you're also setting yourself up for success going forward, because the person that has made a poor decision in the past has been reminded that what is appropriate behavior going into the party this time.
Chantel, what a valuable discussion. Truly, I feel like I learned some new things on this call. All I'm going to throw something else out there as we wrap up this call. In the event, fingers crossed this doesn't happen, but in the event that something does go wrong, you all are truly lucky, because Chantel and I are actually going to be chatting again in January, all about how to handle employee investigations effectively. So our and toes are crossed for you all that these tips help you, nothing goes wrong. But if something does go wrong, know that you are in good hands, because come January, Chantel and I will be back walking you through all our best practices on how to handle employee investigations. Chantel, thank you so, so much. This was a fascinating call. I'm so excited for January, and I'm so excited for everyone to have some really fun, inclusive, logic-based company parties, and the ability and the language to communicate the thought process behind this to their leadership teams. Thank you again, and really, really excited to connect again in January.